Okay, welcome everybody to today's webinar. I'm Mona Forrest, Operations Manager at the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. Thank you for attending today's webinar entitled Canada's New Drug Pricing Rules. What are the implications for cancer patients? New federal regulations governing the Patent Medicine Prices Review Board, which you will hear often referred through this presentation as a PMPRB. So we'll be talking about the Patent Medicine Prices Review Board. So new federal regulations governing the PMPRB and the regulation of drug prices will come into effect in 6 months' time on January 1st, 2021. The changes have been very controversial. The PMPRB has just released its proposed guidelines to implement the new regulations and is now consulting on them with stakeholders and the public. So this is your chance. So we find out more about it and see if you want to have your say. The webinar is going to be presented by Ryan Clarke, founder and president of Advocacy Solutions, and Wayne Critchley, senior associate of Global Public Affairs. At the end of the presentation, our speakers will answer your questions. However, at any time during the presentation, please feel free to type questions into the window at the bottom right hand of your screen. Bottom right of your screen, you should see it clearly, questions. For those of you who have not attended one of our webinars before, the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network is an organization working with cancer patients and survivors to learn about health system complexities, to connect with others, to plan action, and then act to promote best care and healthier survivorship. If you'd like to learn more about CCSN, visit our website at www.survivornet.ca. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available tomorrow on YouTube. In addition, the slides will be available on SlideShare. Links to both will be sent to the email you provided, and there will be links on the front page of our website at www.survivornet.ca. Now I'll turn things over to our presenters. Welcome, Ryan and Wayne.
Thank you very much, Mona. It's Wayne Critchley here, and I will start off the presentation today. And I might just note for your information that I have a fair bit of background with respect to the Patent Medicine Prices Review Board. As I was the executive director of the board for 15 years, from 1990 to 2005. And although I've been out of the bureaucracy of government since then, I find that I'm continually sort of pulled back into the issue as we have new questions arise, such as these proposed changes to the regulations and guidelines affecting drug pricing in Canada. So I retain currency as a result of that. I'm going to go through the proposed changes. I warn you now, they're very complex, so I'm going to try to make it as straightforward as I can. And then at the end, Ryan will pick up and we'll have a few messages about next steps and things that you can do if you want to become more engaged in this topic. Oops. Oops, okay, here we go, sorry. So just a quick overview of how I want to approach this today. First of all, just to review why we're here, what this is all about. I'll spend a few minutes talking about what the Patent Medicine Prices Review Board is and how it came to be and what its purpose is in the system. The new regulations and guidelines that have caused all this controversy over the last few years. We'll try and address the question of the impact of these changes on new oncology medicines in particular, and then look at what's next. So the drivers of PMPRB reform I would argue, are really threefold. The first is there's a political driver of this. The current government in its first, when it was first elected in 2015, had made it a plank of its platform that it would take measures to lower drug prices in Canada. So that's been part of their to-do list, if you will, and the minister's to-do list since 2015. But there were also some pressures, I would argue, from the bureaucracy. The PMPRB itself sought changes, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But essentially, the PMPRB program had not been substantially reformed in 30 years, and the agency itself felt some pressures to try to bring it more in line with current practices and expectations in the market. And the third issue, and key, I think, is the whole question of the high cost of new breakthrough drugs and the pressures that these put on both public and private payers. And this, of course, arises because of the tremendous advances that we've seen in new targeted therapies and cell treatments, etc., that clearly impact in the oncology field and also in the area of drugs for rare diseases. I think I've indicated that there's been a lot of controversy. You might say, well, what's the controversy? Lower prices and access to new drugs sounds like it's pretty straightforward. Well, the controversy because there's a lack of consensus on a number of different aspects of this. The nature and magnitude of the problem is one of the areas. There's no agreement on just what the problem really is. There's certainly no agreement on whether the PMPRB is the appropriate vehicle to achieve to deal with those problems. We already have a variety of systems in place in Canada to address the question of appropriate pricing and funding and reimbursement of drugs. So is the PMPRB the right vehicle to do more changes? And the mechanisms that they've proposed are controversial. They're complex, they're very difficult to put into practice, and so there are a lot of issues about that. Some groups, and in particular some of the patient organizations, have expressed a lot of concern about the consultation process that's been followed and whether it's been adequate or not. It may be that some of you on this webinar have had some of that experience and may want to share some of your experiences with that in the comments. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, there's no consensus on what the impact is going to be. And I'm going to address that in my slides, but there's no real consensus on what this is actually is what's going to happen as a result of these changes. So basically it comes down to, is PMPRB reform going to improve access to important new treatments by making them more affordable? Or is it going to reduce access by creating so many barriers to bringing new drugs to market that manufacturers just don't bother? You know, behind all this is something that when I was with the PMPRB, we always used to talk about it quite a bit. It was always part of many presentations I did to try and draw the distinction between cost and price. On the cost side, PMPRB put out a report not long ago showing that public drug plan spending in Canada grew 6.6% annually over the past 3 years. That's fair enough, but the prices of individual drugs did not increase during that time period. And in fact, they actually declined over that time period. And drugs today account for a smaller share of total healthcare spending than they did 10 years ago. So there's two different perspectives to look at this. And the thing to keep in mind that cost is not just a function of price. Cost is a function of utilization. If you are using a new treatment that did not exist before, that's going to increase your cost, regardless of the price of the drug. Changes in demographics, program design. The introduction of OHIP Plus in Ontario had a significant impact on drug expenditures, as you would expect. That had nothing to do with prices. Oh, sorry, I have done something that's making it difficult for me to move the slides. There we go. Okay, so looking at drug price trends, again, there's two sides to every coin. On the one hand, Canadian prices have been in line with prices of drugs in other major countries. This is the latest report from the PMPRB itself, which shows that Canadian prices are in the middle of the basket of 7 countries they use for comparison purposes, and have been in that same place for the last couple of decades. It's only the US that is really out of line with significantly higher prices, but Canada and the other countries are very similarly placed. But the other way of looking at it, as the government has chosen to do more recently, to say, yes, that's okay, but if we look at a broader selection of countries, if we look at all of the OECD countries, then Canadian prices are 4th highest out of 35 countries. Now, the OECD is a group of countries, mostly in Europe, but around the world, that are linked from the perspective of economic study and analysis. It includes a much broader group of countries than we have looked at for doing drug price comparisons. So it includes countries like Poland, Greece, Turkey, as well as more industrialized countries like Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. So in this case, Canada's prices appear to be relatively high and about 20% above the median of the OECD countries. Another factor, and this is something that the PMPRB continually points out in their various studies and publications, and that is that certain groups of drugs are bigger contributors to the increasing drug costs to the system. And oncology is a major source of this, of course, as you all very well know. So again, a recent report from the PMPRB reports that oncology drugs have increased from just over 5% of total drug sales of patented medicines since 2008 up to close to 21% in 2018. Now again, this is not price. This is cost. This is the cost in the healthcare system of the use of patented drugs for oncology. So maybe I should spend a minute or two to talk a little bit more about what is the PMPRB. First of all, it was created in 1987, and it's part of the Patent Act. It is not a payer. It does not deliver, or it's not responsible for any drug plans or any decisions about what drugs are covered or available in Canada. It is a regulator only, and it regulates the prices of drugs that are patented to ensure that while they have an exclusive monopoly period because of a patent, the manufacturers don't take advantage of that period by charging a price that is considered to be excessive. It's a very straightforward and very specific mandate. Another thing that's very different about the PMPRB compared to drug plans and others in the system is that it's a quasi-judicial tribunal. So it does not give authorization for drugs to be sold. It does not even authorize or approve a price. It certainly has no bearing on the coverage decisions that are made. It is a legal system that requires the board to conduct a hearing before it makes a finding that a price is excessive. It has powers to roll back prices if the price is excessive. So it has teeth, and it has worked over the last 30 years. And the way it has worked is not by holding a lot of hearings, because they're very expensive and they take up a lot of time. It has worked by applying guidelines that give clarity to stakeholders ahead of time about what an allowable price is. So a manufacturer knows today what the rules will be next month if it wants to launch a product in Canada. I think, as I've indicated earlier, there are many who can argue that the PMPRB has in fact fulfilled this mandate and kept prices in line with more developed countries in Europe. Current guidelines are based on therapeutic comparisons. most new drugs cannot be priced higher than the most expensive drug that treats the same disease. The new drug for breast cancer cannot be priced higher than the most expensive existing drug for breast cancer, except when that drug is a breakthrough or the first drug to treat a particular indication. In that case, it can be priced up to the median of prices in that basket of 7 countries. Over time, prices cannot increase more than the CPI. In fact, they haven't been increasing at all over the past couple of decades. And on average, Canadian prices should not exceed the median of the 7 countries. As indicated earlier, if you read the annual report of the PMPRB, you would say it's achieved its objectives. Its prices have been stable for many, many years. Canadian prices are 20% below the median of foreign prices. And when it's had to, the board applies its penalties and has collected voluntary compliance undertakings in over 110 cases to date, and also can, through voluntary compliance or through as a result of a hearing, can order price reductions and measures to offset excess revenues. So it sounds good, but then why are people wanting to change it? Well, the critics have a lot of points that they make, and really looking at the whole system. They say that the high cost of innovative new drugs puts undue pressure on drug budgets. And I think we can appreciate and understand where that concern comes from. They also say that, well, okay, we're in line with major countries in Europe, but we're higher than most of the OECD countries. And they say we shouldn't be comparing prices to the US. It's an outlier. So even though it's our biggest trading partner and our next door neighbor, we should not be comparing prices to the US. They argue that patentees have not lived up to their 10% R&D commitment. I'm not going to touch that one today, but would be happy to address it if there's a question later on. But I just make the point that there's, once again, this is arguable, and there's 2 sides to that coin, but it's really irrelevant because it's not related to pricing in terms of the Patent Act, what the Patent Act provides and the powers of the PMPRB. It is not a factor that the board is entitled or supposed to consider. So that's a separate discussion that folks should have with government. And as I said earlier, based on the OECD reports, our prices are relatively high and our spending is relatively high compared to other countries. But again, recall, spending means cost plus utilization. So since the board was created 30 years ago, there's been huge changes in the drug environment. In 1987, there was very little in the way of price regulation at the provincial level. But over the past 30 years, we've seen a tremendous expansion in the various cost containment policies used by public drug plans. We've seen the creation of national and pan-Canadian systems that impact on drugs in Canada. CADTH, I'm sure you're familiar with, and INES. You're familiar with the Common Drug Review and the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review. These are all new programs introduced in the past 10, 15, 20 years that now conduct rigorous cost effectiveness reviews of new drugs. And these are used by governments to inform their reimbursement decisions and to help them in negotiating appropriate prices with manufacturers. The PCPA is the newest part of that whole system. And as you know, the PCPA has been able to achieve very significant reductions in spending by governments, estimated at being well over $2 billion annually. So as a result of this, many question whether the PMPRB is still relevant. And that's what led the PMPRB to do its own review, and it came up with ideas. And since the federal government wanted to do something about lowering drug prices, it has adopted those recommendations, and in 2017 announced that it would be reforming the PMPRB. So what does the reform take? Well, I must emphasize that it does not involve any change to the Patent Act at all. So there's no change to that excessive price standard. That legal framework and that price standard remains the same. What the government has proposed to do through regulation is to change a number of factors that the board takes into account in determining excessive price. So first, like it says, like 3 legs of a stool. The first leg is to change the basket of comparator countries. The second leg is to introduce new economic pricing factors, pharmacoeconomics, size of the market, the factors that are important from the perspective of reimbursement bodies. And they want to increase access to information on the third-party rebates that manufacturers pay under their listing agreements with governments as a result of the PCPA. New basket of countries, pretty straightforward, really. They've removed the 2 most expensive countries in the basket. US and Switzerland have been removed, so they'll no longer be considered by PMPRB. And they've added a number of lower priced countries. And the explicit goal here was to lower the median of this new basket, or to create a basket that established a median that was equivalent to the median of the OECD. And based on reports from the PMPRB over the last few years, it would appear that that would lower prices for drugs by about 20%. So that one move alone is destined to have an impact in the market. So as for the other factors, they have really had to be developed in the form of new guidelines. And so the PMPRB has been working on this for several years now, working on new guidelines. And their proposals have evolved quite significantly over the past 3 years. The latest version came out in June, and that is it's this document that you are being invited to make a submission on if you choose to do so. I think the main point here is that this is a complete reformulation. It's a complete, it's like they're basically throwing out the old guidelines and starting afresh. So that instead of reviewing the average net price to determine compliance, they're now going to review 2 prices. They'll review the list price for the drug, and they'll review the rebated price. That is the actual price once you take into account the third-party rebates and other discounts that prevail for drugs in the marketplace. Now, don't worry when you look at this. There won't be a quiz on it. I'm not asking you to study it, but I do want to include this slide so that if you want to learn more, you can look at it later on for more detail. But this is the schematic of how the new guidelines will work. And I included here really just to show you that it's there, it's available, but also to illustrate the complexity of this system. It is highly complex. There are many variations, exceptions, alterations, etc., throughout this whole schematic. I'm going to try to summarize it as best as I can and decomplicate it, but I can't do it justice fully because there are so many details that I will not possibly be able to cover today. So, at its heart, these new guidelines propose that all new patented drugs will have a maximum list price that's based on the median international price. So that's pretty straightforward in itself. It becomes more complicated when we look at what they call category 1 drugs, which are really the more high cost drugs. In that case, there will also be a maximum rebated price, and they're going to calculate that price and then require that manufacturers not have a net price after rebates and discounts that's higher than that calculated price. So what's category 1? Well, this has been quite an area of discussion over the last couple of years. The current formula is drugs that have a high treatment cost of $90,000 per patient per year, or annual revenues of $50 million based on the estimates of what the market size of the product will be once it's on the market. These definitions are expected to capture about 25% of all new medicines. And I might point out that these thresholds represent a significant change from what they had proposed just a year ago. And one reason they've made the change is that it was pointed out to them by CAPCA and other parties that they were going to be capturing virtually all new drugs under the original threshold. So they've increased the thresholds considerably. So they're only going to be capturing those that are that are more high cost and have greater budget impact. But I need to note that in doing that, what they're also capturing though are the new, if I can call them, the more high-tech new drugs, targeted therapies, and such as some of the drugs that we're seeing in oncology and in rare diseases that are designed for and only appropriate for a relatively small number of patients. If they're high cost, those drugs will be targeted. And other high cost drugs where the volume may be high because there is demand for it. Drugs that are used by a large number of people will very easily reach that 50 million market size, and they'll be included. Now, the calculation of this maximum rebated price is where it really gets complicated. And so again, I'm going to try and simplify it as best I can. But the PMPRB staff will apply formulas to calculate a pharmacoeconomic price that's based on the CADTH recommendations. Well, I'll leave it there. We can come back to that if need be. But the point here is that if you're familiar with a P-CODER recommendation, you will know that they're based on a lot of assumptions in the analysis, and also usually involve a fair bit of variability. So the big question here is how the PMPRB staff are going to come up with a precise dollar calculation, but that's to be determined. And in the case of these category 1 drugs, the rebated price will have to be lower than the list price by as much as 50%. And again, complicated formula about how you figure out what the percentage is, but it means that in essence that they'll be required to give a rebate of up to 50% for those drugs. But it might be reduced even further depending on market size. The guidelines allow for an additional reduction of up to 35%. So we're talking about a big impact on net prices. So impacts of reform, well, lower prices, sure, but by how much? The list price reduction based on OECD could be as much as 20%, but what about the rebates? We don't know, but they could be as high as 60, 70% under the PMPRB's proposed guidelines. They clearly are trying to limit drug expenditures or control drug expenditures, but they don't do so explicitly, and that is another area for, I think, for further debate and discussion. A key part of this that I want to emphasize is that there is greater price uncertainty as a result of this. I mentioned earlier that under the current guidelines, it's easy to predict what the allowable price will be. Even a year from now, you would be able to predict what your allowable price will be because the rules are well known and they're clear. But now you won't. And in fact, you'll have to wait until after you've launched a product, started filing and reporting to PMPRB, and gone through the CADTH 9S processes and have a review from P-CODER and a final recommendation before they can start trying to calculate an allowable price. So that can take anywhere from several months to several years after the initial launch of the drug. That creates a lot of uncertainty for the manufacturer, particularly when a difference of opinion could mean a reduction as much as 50% or more from the price that you had intended or expected to sell at. So how will this impact access to new drugs? Well, I'm going to come to some information on that in a minute, but the Innovative Medicines Canada has argued that this uncertainty and these new low price thresholds will reduce incentives to bring new drugs to market in Canada. The PMPRB disputes that, but let's face it, we're not really going to know for sure until the system has been in place, and maybe been in place for a couple of years. So that's a big risk that we are taking as a society. There's also the impact on clinical trials. If you don't think you're going to be able to sell your new product in a country after you go through the trials and get marketing approval, if you don't think you're going to want to sell in that country, then why do the clinical trial there? So that's another area of concern that we are seeing. So I've touched on some of these concerns: complexity, uncertainty. Again, as a former executive director of the board and someone who understands how the process works, I'm very concerned about the discretion given to board staff. We have relied for a long time on clear guidelines that are straightforward and are understandable and encourage patentees to comply so that they don't have to go to a hearing and deal with that aspect of the system. But now there is more discretion to board staff and so many areas of potential dispute between board staff and the manufacturer that the risk of going to hearings is much, much greater. In fact, the risk is so much greater that the government has already increased the budget of the PMPRB considerably for the purposes of conducting more hearings. They anticipate that there will be more litigation coming out of that. And litigation, by the way, is not just expensive, but it adds time. You know, one of the cases that the PMPRB has been dealing with for about 5 years or so now, is Solaris. It's still under appeal in the courts. So we still don't have a final price for that drug for PMPRB purposes, even though it's been on the market for close to 10 years. So this is not a speedy or efficient process. So bottom line, will these concerns discourage launching of new drugs and discourage clinical trials? Well, Life Sciences Ontario did a survey of pharma executives last winter and asked them what therapeutic areas they thought would most likely be impacted. And leading the list was oncology. No real surprise there. Also, by the way, it was like almost 100% who said that there would be an impact on the launch of new drugs. And are we seeing delayed launches? Well, because we've known about these changes for a while, even though we haven't known all the details, there is some evidence that we may already be seeing some impact on the availability of new drugs in Canada. And this graph shows an increase in the delays of new drugs that had been approved by Health Canada, delays in the actual launch of those drugs, seeing based on some analysis from last winter. So this is obviously an area that will continue to be monitored very carefully in the coming months. Finally, court challenges. I've talked quite a bit about litigation because the PMPRB is a legal, it's a quasi-judicial board. It's very much founded on law, and it requires legal processes. Not surprising at all, the new PMPRB reform has been the subject of some court challenges, and two in particular that are most significant. The first one is an action taken by Innovative Medicines Canada and a large number of companies, challenging the authority of the government to make these new regulations in the first place, challenging that they go beyond the authority given by Parliament in the Patent Act. And the first hearing on that case just took place last month, first decision, and the trial court struck down the regulation requiring the reporting of rebates. So in essence, it struck down one of the three legs that I mentioned of the PMPRB reform, and it struck that down as being outside the authority of the government because it's not provided for by the Patent Act itself. One of the issues in that situation is that although it upheld that the other two legs of the stool are reasonable, what it did not consider, wasn't asked to consider, the fact that the PMPRB itself has proposed that its whole new system of rebated price guidelines, it's all based on the access to the information on third-party rebates. So if they don't have that access to that information, will that second leg stand based on the way that they have attempted to apply it to this point? We shall soon see. And although no appeals have been filed in that first case yet, they both may be appealed on both sides, because both sides won and both sides lost. So both sides may choose to appeal, in which case this matter could continue for some time. The other case is arguably more significant because it's a constitutional challenge, and it's been taken in the Quebec Superior Court by Merck and some other major companies. And it's basically alleging that the new PMPRB regime, in light of these new regulations, is not constitutional. It's not within the powers of the federal parliament, that it goes well beyond using patent authority over patent in order to legislate in an area that is really an area of provincial jurisdiction. This is potentially even more significant, to say, than the other case. It has not been heard yet. It will be heard in September, so we may not get a decision until next year, but it will obviously have impact on the whole system. So far, what's happening? Well, we are in a state of a limbo to a certain extent. PMPRB said that they intend to proceed with their proposed guidelines regardless of the federal court decision. And they've asked stakeholders to give them advice on how they can apply, how they can address that second leg of the stool, how they can address the issue of applying these new factors on rebated price when they don't have the right to get access to the relevant information. So that's a question that is outstanding. In the meantime, though, submissions are due August 4th. The deadline's getting closer all the time. PMPRB plans to finalize its guidelines in the fall and to implement the whole regime in its entirety in January 2021, in line with the coming into force of the new regulations. And the court challenges will continue. So excuse my cheesy graphic at the end there, but I say stay tuned. This ain't over. Ryan, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thanks, Wayne. I just have 2 slides to go through with everybody, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments. So as Wayne said, there is a public engagement process currently underway. There are actually 2 of them, formal input processes underway. The first one, as Wayne said, is a call for direct public input to PMPRB, which closes on August 4th, and there's a link to how to access that. But there's also a call by the Conservative Party of Canada, particular MP, for public feedback into this process. And their process input closes on September 4th. So it's another opportunity for folks to also make their voices heard. If we go to the next slide, we recognize, though, that for many individuals and many stakeholders, that input process, those 2 formal input processes, are something that a lot of individuals may not necessarily feel comfortable providing input into. So if we go to the next slide, the CCSN is going to be providing engagement as well into this process, and in fact into both of these formal processes. And they'll be posting a copy of their comments on the CCSN website. And so for those individuals or organizations who want to provide into one or both of these formal input processes, that's terrific. For those of you who don't feel comfortable doing so, one of the things that we're suggesting is that you could take the CCSN formal input that they're going to be providing, and send it to your Member of Parliament. As Wayne has explained to everybody, PMPRB was created under the Patent Act, and that's federal legislation. And those proposed legislation, or those proposed changes to their regulations and guidelines, are under the purview of the federal government. Patents are within the jurisdiction, the constitutional jurisdiction, to provide legislation around federally as opposed to provincially. So when you have an issue with an area of law or an area of public policy that falls within the federal government's jurisdiction, then you engage your federal Member of Parliament. And so CCSN is encouraging people to forward their input, including the comments of CCSN, directly to their members of Parliament. So if you have an issue with anything that you've heard today, if you would like to provide input into those processes, you can do it. But we're also encouraging you to take this to the political folks, the ones who are responsible jurisdictionally for what's going on here. And you can do that directly by providing your own comments, but as I've said, by also appending what CCSN has to say. So I will leave it at that, and I will turn it back over to Mona.
Thank you. I'm just going to make sure I've got a shared screen here. I'm looking at questions. Right now I'm only seeing one from Michael. Can you please explain rebates? Third-party rebates is the question.
Sure, let me have a go at that. So what has developed, I guess, in the past 10, 15 years is Ontario launched this process, and it's now used nationally across the country, is that major public drug plans negotiate with manufacturers for listing agreements to when they choose to cover or list a drug for reimbursement purposes. And those agreements may include a variety of conditions. They are largely informed on the government side by the recommendations that come out of CADTH in terms of the clinical criteria and other conditions under which the drug should be reimbursed. But critical to it is governments want to save money. And they made it clear when they started this process, their objective was to use their buying power and through the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance to use their joint buying power to negotiate better prices with manufacturers. So they basically go to manufacturers and say, look, here, we're prepared to discuss covering this drug, but we need a listing agreement, and we need you to recognize that we represent a very substantial size of the market if we cover this. So we would like to receive some rebate or some financial consideration. And manufacturers enter into those agreements and provide rebates back to governments. Now, these are all confidential. These are financial transactions. These are commercial transactions that are entered into between the reimbursement body and the drug manufacturer. They are invoiced by the drug plans at the end of a year. They invoice back to the manufacturer what their reimbursement has been of the drug in question, and they receive financial rebate. In most cases, as far as I know, that rebate does not go to the drug plan or the cancer agency. This may not be totally up to date, but my information has been that those rebates go directly to the general revenues of government and are not credited back to the drug fund. Now, that may have changed. Arguably, it should, but it has. But these rebates are substantial, and they, according to information from the Auditor General of Ontario, they appear to represent as much as 30% to the province in terms of rebates received back. Does that answer the question? Ryan, would you want to add anything to that?
No, Wayne, not from my perspective. Thanks.
Okay, I have one more question from Joanne. She says, when should I reach out to my MP about this issue? Is there a deadline?
So there is not, and in fact, that's one of the important parts of this exercise. So while the formal input processes closed, the first one on August 4th, the second one on September 4th, this opportunity or request for you to engage with your MPP goes on. In fact, arguably it goes on until this comes into effect, so really the balance of the year. So we encourage people to begin reaching out to their MPs now. We encourage you to, as I've said several times, to append CCSN's or other people's responses to the formal processes when those come out. And then even after the process, the formal processes conclude, you can still be engaging your MPs and asking them to take a look at this and potentially to delay the implementation or to make the requisite changes on behalf of cancer patients in Canada.
Okay, Joanne is also asking, what information should I share with my MP around this issue to gain their attention?
I think one of the primary things that you can say, and Wayne has certainly talked about this, is the uncertainty. You know, it is complicated, and I don't think anybody is expecting most people to get into the details of the proposed changes. But I think the uncertainty and I think the concern that these changes are going to potentially result in fewer medications coming to Canada, which means fewer cancer patients are going to get access to those newer treatments. It's a very real concern. And as Wayne has outlined, it's a concern if for no other reason, because the mandate is not as clear as it was before. And a lack of clarity equals a lack of certainty. And that's very real. That's not an unreasonable position to take. I wouldn't even call it speculation. I think it's very logical. So just the increased uncertainty is something that I think is a reasonable position to talk to your MP about, and also just to educate them, to just say, do you know this is going on? And let's not forget, we're in a minority parliament federally. We're not in a majority government. You could make the argument that in a majority government, if it were the Liberals, they would simply do what they want to do, and that would be it. That's not the case. So in a minority parliament, where the opposition parties will have a say in this, or could have a say in this, I should say, if the government chose to go down that road, they could put pressure on the governing party to either halt or delay or change what's going on. That will happen if Canadians stand up and say something.
Another question from Hervé. Are we better to appeal to politicians personally, or are we better to do so as members of a patient group, i.e. myeloma patients group or blood cancer patients?
I think the answer is both. I think you want to do it as an individual who is either impacted, potentially impacted by this, who has a concern about this. This is actually an issue for Canadians. It is not just an issue for people with cancer, for example. This is an issue for, I would suggest, all Canadians. In a publicly funded healthcare system, everybody should be looking at this and saying, wait a minute, are they doing what we think is in the best interest of Canadians? We have some concerns, we have some questions. So I would encourage certainly everybody as individuals to approach their MPs. However, if you're also part of an organization, those organizations as organizations could be reaching out to the Minister of Health, other ministers, MPs in the areas in which, for example, your patient group may be situated. You should absolutely be reaching out and perhaps engaging several MPs, cabinet ministers or otherwise. And again, don't forget opposition members as well, because like I said, we're in a minority parliament. So approaching opposition leaders, health critics, people like that, I think is another very important part of this exercise. So I would encourage engagement across any number of levels by individuals.
Very, very good advice, Ryan. And if I may add another element perhaps to that is, don't forget about your provincial health ministries and health ministers, because people asked me earlier on, why is the federal government using the PMPRB to do this? This is not a very good way of achieving what they want to do. And I said, well, the reason they're doing it is because they have the authority to do it, and they don't have to get anybody's agreement. There's no federal provincial agreement required. They just do it. But nonetheless, this impacts provincial drug programs and cancer programs to a very great extent. It impacts whole life sciences sectors in provinces. And so the provincial governments have not been making a lot of noise on this. And maybe they're not all that aware of it. So I would encourage you to also let your local MPP or MLA and local health minister, let them know about your concerns as well.
Okay, I have a question from Tracy. How much effect does the U.S. drug market impact our prices? Will removing them after access to research, development, and use of drugs for rare diseases and oncology patients?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a complex aspect of this. But I think it is important to notice we can't forget the U.S. it's our largest trading partner. And it influences so much of what we know in terms of medical treatments. And when things are available in the US, we're going to want to have them available here. So I think there will be no question there will be added pressure in the system if we can't obtain new treatments when they become available in the US. Taking the US out of the PMPRB basket was always a controversial thing. When I was with the PMPRB, I'd like to point out it really is almost irrelevant because the PMPRB uses the median of that basket. And the US is the only time the US is relevant is if it's the only comparator country, and that doesn't usually last for long. So the US is really important, but we really need to ensure that we also recognize that we are different markets. One of the reasons I've heard people say, well, we need to deal with high drug prices because I keep reading how the prices are going up. Look at the price of insulin, it's skyrocketed. And I remind them, it's skyrocketed in the United States where there's no price controls. It hasn't moved in Canada. This is a totally different market. And so that's not an issue. But nonetheless, that informs, I guess, the kind of attitude and beliefs that we have about the nature of the problem here. So it's a very long-winded response, and I probably didn't answer the question fully, but there are a lot of implications with the U.S.
Another question, Jessica is asking, how will the 2020 guidelines impact access to clinical trials?
Well, the first answer is they don't have any direct impact on clinical trials because the PMPRB has no direct authority or powers with respect to clinical trials. This is an area where there is debate. PMPRB will argue that pricing rules in the country have no bearing on where clinical trials are conducted. And they will pull out some evidence to support that that's historically been the case. But note that that's how things have been and not how things will be in future. I look at things like the LSO survey and come to a very different conclusion. And I know from dealing with a number of companies that manufacture and supply drugs in Canada who are concerned about this, who say, well, why would I start a clinical trial in Canada if I don't believe that I will be able to launch the drug here later on? There's no point. It's contrary to a good public practice and public interest. I can't do that. And so that's an issue. And recall that most of these companies are global companies. They're multinational companies. The Canadian managers always want to bring the drug to Canada, but they have to get approval globally. And if the Canadian market is not sufficiently attractive or creates so many concerns and worries and risks to the company, they will hold off. And at some time, probably not, not necessarily today, but at some time in the future, that will be felt on clinical trials. But there is that evidence I pointed to earlier that's being monitored carefully, that it looks like there's already been some impact on clinical trials. So we'll continue to watch that.
Okay, we're needing to wrap up shortly. I'm sorry for people who didn't get their questions answered, but if you send them to us at info@SurvivorNet, we'll try and get them answered for you. To wrap up, perhaps this is a good wrap-up question. Laura asks, what is the most objective source of information on PMPRB reform?
That's a great question. The deck today, you could consider that. I would argue that it's subjective. The reality is that, unfortunately, this is an issue that has really polarized debate, polarized discussion, and I think that's been seen throughout the process. Anytime there've been any verbal or written consultations, you see that people take pretty hard lines on both sides of the coin. I've tried to make the presentation today as objective as I could, and I hope you find it useful that way.
Okay, there's a good wrap-up comment that's not quite a question, and then I'll wrap up. Dennis says that this was an absolutely great presentation. So thank you both, and I'm going to connect back. So everyone on our big list, thank you for attending today's webinar entitled Canada's New Drug Pricing Rules. What are the implications for cancer patients? CCSN would like to thank our presenters, Ryan Clarke, founder and president of Advocacy Solutions, and Wayne Critchley, senior associate of Global Public Affairs. The webinar will be available tomorrow on YouTube, and the slides will be available on SlideShare. Links to both will be sent to the email you provided, and they'll be available on our website at www.survivornet.ca. Stay tuned for upcoming, there's some really interesting webinars coming up by checking our website or sign up to receive our free e-letter, and you can sign up on the first page of our website. Thank you all again, our speakers and our attendees. In the meanwhile, stay safe. Thank you.